here in Nairobi. All right, we now want to move on. And the rights lobby group Human Rights Watch says at least 12 people were killed and more than 100 badly injured by police during post-election protests. In a report released on Monday, Human Rights Watch said Kenya's election was marred by human rights violations and house-to-house operations in Western Kenya. The watch said the August 8th general election included unlawful killings and beatings by police during protests. Researchers interviewed 43 people, including victims of police beatings and shootings in Kisumu and Siaya counties, examined bodies in mortuaries in Kisumu and Siaya counties too, and visited victims at Jaramogi Oginga Odinga Teaching and Referral Hospital. Well, for more on this report, I'm joined by Otsieno Namwaya, who's the Africa researcher at the Human Rights Watch from our City Center studio. Thank you very much for joining us, Otsieno. So how long did it take you for you to conduct these investigations, and how intricate were they?
Thank you, Betty. But at the time when the elections were happening, we were actually in Western Kenya, town of Kisumu, doing the preliminary work there. And we continued with this work throughout the process, throughout the time when the violence was happening, and proceeded beyond the violence itself up to around 17th of this month. What we did talk to mostly victims of beatings and also the families and of the victims. But we did also, like you mentioned, we did go to mortuaries, we did go to hospital wards to visit the victims there, and we listened to careful accounts of people who had been beaten by police. But we did also manage to talk to a few police officers off record who explained to us how the operation had been planned.
Then about that they gave the police officers that you spoke with, what was the reason really with all this violence and the beatings and the killings?
Pardon, I didn't get that.
Yes, you've said that you were able to speak to police officers who came out to speak to you, secretly. What was the reason that they told you they had been given for this particular operation?
I think the impression we got, the understanding we got from all sides of the people we talked to, including our own assessment, was that the Kenyan authorities had made a decision even before the elections to be heavy-handed to any protests or any form of protests during the election. So police were prepared and briefed clearly before the elections. And when the protests started, I think the police moved in swiftly. In the case of Kisumu, I think some of the killings that we have indicated in our report happened even before Kenyatta was declared winner on August 11th. But most of the killings and the beatings and door-to-door operations happened on 11th and 12th. And people are being flushed out of their houses and beaten, sometimes even shot at. A lot of the people who were injured or even killed were actually not part of the protest. So some of the operation actually went beyond just containing protests. It looked like now it was an attempt to victimize the entire neighborhoods in Kisumu and parts of Siaya County.
All right. Now, just a few days after the protests and the violence and the police brutality was reported, Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights came and gave out the number as 24 of the people who had died as a result of this, violence meted out on, protesters. But you give a number of 12. Why do we have these discrepancies in numbers of the people who lost their lives?
There's no discrepancy at all, actually, if you look at it carefully. Our report talks about Kisumu and Siaya only. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights report talks about the places affected by violence across the country, including Nairobi. So if you look at that report of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, they provide a figure of 17 in Nairobi alone, and they provide a figure of 1 in Kisumu. But in Kisumu, we are talking about 10. So that means that our figure is actually higher. The difference being that the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights came out much earlier before certain facts came to light, but we did take some time to establish certain things, so our figure in Kisumu is much higher by 9. Our figures in Nairobi are not yet out, and from what we have preliminarily suggests that we might actually be having higher figures in Nairobi than what the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights did put out. But we are not saying that there are discrepancies.
Right.
It's just because the Kenya National Commission came out much earlier.
All right. Finally, one of the narratives that we had from the leadership in regards to the security docket, that includes Fred Matiang'i, who's still acting CS of Interior. He came out and said that, police were acting on criminal gangs. Were you able to really investigate these claims that he made, that indeed sometimes the people who lost their lives were not really protesters, but they were criminals?
If you look at our report, Betty, we clearly explain who in our report was killed and under what circumstances they were killed. And we also explain how people were injured, how people got injured. And if you look at that explanation clearly, there is no indication that police were actually hunting for criminals. When police begin to conduct door-to-door operations, that ceases to be an attempt to look for criminals. They were actually going from house to house and asking for any male in that house. They're not asking for criminals. They're asking for any person who is a male in the house. And when they got the male, they did beat the male. In most cases, they injured them or they shot at them. That was not an operation that was looking for criminals. That was an operation that was basically victimizing the residents of Kisumu and Siaya counties. All
right. Thank you very, very much, Otsieno Namwaya, joining us from our City Center studio. He is an African researcher at the Human Rights Watch. Now, they have released a report in regards to the violence and the protests, the killings, the beatings, and really violence meted out on protesters after the elections. He's put in the number, the organization Human Rights Watch is putting the number of people who lost their lives at 12 people and more who were also injured, about 100.